Hello, it's great to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The sun over Purgatory Gulch, Colorado, was not a nurturing star, but a merciless tyrant. It beat down on the parched earth with the fury of a blacksmith's hammer, turning the main street into a river of shimmering heat and fine, choking dust. For Silas, the town was a necessary evil, a festering sore on the hide of the land that he was forced to visit a few times a year for salt, flour, and the bitter taste of civilization he'd long since abandoned. He tied his buckskin mare, Daisy, to the hitching post outside the general store, the worn leather of his saddle creaking in protest. Silas was a man carved from the same rugged landscape he called home. His shoulders were broad from felling timber, and his hands were calloused maps of hard labor. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a quiet testament to a life lived largely alone, with lines etched around eyes the color of a stormy sky. Those eyes missed nothing, a holdover from his years as an army scout, a life he'd left behind along with most of his faith in men. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of cured tobacco, coffee beans, and cheap whiskey. He nodded curtly to the proprietor, a balding man named Floyd, and gathered his supplies in silence. His list was short, his movements efficient. He wanted nothing more than to load his pack mule and retreat to the solace of his valley, where the only voices were the wind in the pines and the ghosts in his memory. The loudest ghost was Ida, his sister, lost to him a decade ago in the bloody clashes that had torn the territory apart. He could still see her face framed by blonde hair, her spirit as bright and untamable as a prairie fire. The guilt of not being there to protect her was a stone in his gut, a permanent weight he carried with every sunrise. With his goods paid for and packed, Silas was turning to leave when a sound cut through the drone of the town, a wave of coarse laughter and jeering shouts from the far end of the street near the livery stable. It was a cruel, hungry sound, the kind that promised someone's misfortune was another's entertainment. His first instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, was to ignore it. Purgatory Gulch's particular brand of misery was not his to mend. But then he saw him. Clarence, a man whose soul was as rotten as a week-old corpse. Dressed in a gaudy waistcoat and a sneer that never left his face, Clarence was a trader in everything that could be bought or stolen, including human lives. He was preening at the edge of the crowd, his eyes gleaming with a vulture's avarice. Whatever was happening, Clarence was at the heart of it, and that alone made Silas's jaw tighten. Against his better judgment, he moved toward the commotion, his boots sinking into the thick dust. He pushed through a wall of rough-looking miners and drifters, the stench of sweat and unwashed bodies thick in the air. In the center of the clearing was a makeshift wooden platform. On it stood a man with a booming voice and a whip coiled in his hand, and beside him, chained at the wrists, stood two Native American men and one woman. An auction, a slave auction, thinly veiled as the sale of captives of war. A cold, familiar rage coiled in Silas's stomach. He had seen this depravity before, in the war-torn territories where honor went to die. He had fought against the very men who profited from such barbarism. He turned to go, the sight too much to bear, the ugliness of it stirring the ghosts he tried so hard to keep buried. And then he saw her. She was the last to be brought forward. The two warriors had been sold quickly for a pittance to a mining foreman looking for cheap labor. But the woman, the crowd grew quieter, their gazes a mixture of lust and scorn. She was Apache. That much was clear from the cut of her torn buckskin dress and the proud, high line of her cheekbones. Her black hair was matted with dust and what looked like dried blood, but it fell in a thick sheet down her back. Her hands were bound in front of her, her body bruised and weary. But it was her eyes that held Silas captive. They were not the eyes of a broken thing. They were dark, deep-set, and burned with a fire that the heat of the sun could not match. As the auctioneer spouted his vile rhetoric, describing her as a strong-backed doe perfect for farm work or warming a lonely man's bed, she did not flinch. She did not look down. Her gaze swept over the leering faces of the crowd, not with fear, but with a contempt so pure it was almost regal. Her chin was lifted in an act of defiance so profound it seemed to hold up the sky itself. In that unyielding posture, in that refusal to be diminished, Silas saw the ghost of his sister. He saw Ida's stubborn pride, her unshakable will. He remembered how she would stand up to anyone, her small frame radiating a strength that belied her years. This woman was a stranger, from a different people, a different world, but her spirit was one he recognized. It was a light in the suffocating darkness of this place, and he found he could not turn his back on it. "We'll start the bidding at $20, the auctioneer bellowed. "Hey, fine price for such a hardy specimen." Clarence stepped forward, a fat cigarillo clamped between his teeth. "25, he called out, his voice slick with ownership. He winked at the woman, a vile, possessive gesture that made her eyes flash with renewed fire. Another man bid 30. Clarence immediately countered with 40, his gaze never leaving the woman on the platform. He was enjoying this, the power, the public display of his dominance. He wanted not just to own her, but to break her. Silas stood frozen, his mind at war with his heart. The money in his pouch was for a new section of fencing, for seed grain, for the very survival of his ranch through the coming winter. It was the sum of 6 months of relentless back-breaking work. To spend it here on this, it was madness. It was ruin. $40 going once, the auctioneer sang out. The woman, Nizhoni, met Silas's gaze across the sea of hostile faces. For a fleeting second, her mask of defiance wavered, and he saw a flicker of something else, not fear, but a profound and weary sorrow. It was the look of a soul that had endured too much loss, and in that moment, the fate of his ranch, the fence posts, the seed grain, all of it turned to dust. All that mattered was the flicker of light in her eyes, a light he refused to let Clarence extinguish. 50, Silas said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a blade. The crowd turned, surprise rippling through them. They knew him as the quiet rancher from the high valley, the man who kept to himself. What business did he have here? Clarence's sneer tightened. He shot Silas a look of pure venom. 60, 70, Silas countered immediately, his voice stronger now, harder. His hand rested on the leather pouch at his belt, feeling the weight of his future draining away. 80, Clarence spat, his face flushing with anger. The crowd murmured, enjoying the unexpected fight. Silas didn't look at them. He only looked at the woman on the block. He was no longer just buying her freedom. He was fighting for the memory of his sister, for the last shred of decency within himself. 100, Silas stated, his voice ringing with finality. It was everything he had, every last coin. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was an astronomical sum. Clarence's jaw dropped. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. He had been beaten, and publicly so. He glared at Silas, a silent promise of future retribution in his eyes, before turning and shoving his way back through the crowd. $100, the auctioneer roared, his eyes wide with disbelief and greed. Going once, going twice, sold, to the quiet man in the back. The sound of the gavel was like a gunshot in the sudden silence. The transaction was done. Silas walked forward, the sea of men parting before him. He ignored their stares, their whispers of Indian lover and crazy fool. He stepped up to the platform and handed the heavy pouch of coins to the auctioneer, his movements stiff. Then he turned to the woman, Nizhoni. He pulled a knife from his belt and with a single swift motion cut the ropes binding her wrists. She did not thank him. She did not speak. She simply stood there rubbing her chafed skin, her dark eyes searching his face, looking for the truth behind his actions. Was he a savior, or just a different kind of monster? For a long moment, they just looked at each other amidst the dust and the hate of Purgatory Gulch. He had just spent his entire future on a woman whose name he didn't even know, driven by a ghost and a flicker of defiance in her eyes. He had bought her, and now he had no idea what to do with her. The ride out of Purgatory Gulch was a silent ordeal. Silas led the way, his pack mule trailing behind him, while the Apache woman followed on his mare Daisy. He had offered her the reins without a word, a simple gesture that felt monumental. It was an offering of control, a statement that she was not a prisoner to be led by a rope. She had accepted them with a flicker of surprise in her dark eyes, her expression otherwise unreadable. She rode with a natural, effortless grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. Despite her exhaustion and the indignity she had suffered, her back was ramrod straight, her head held high. She was a silent, watchful presence behind him, and Silas could feel her gaze on his back, dissecting his every move, searching for weakness, for intent. The sun climbed higher, relentless and punishing. The landscape around them was a stark panorama of rock and scrub, the mountains a distant, hazy promise on the horizon. The only sounds were the plodding of hooves on the hard-packed earth and the occasional cry of a hawk circling in the vast, empty sky. The silence between them was not peaceful. It was a heavy blanket woven with suspicion, trauma, and unspoken questions. Silas wrestled with the magnitude of what he had done. He had acted on an impulse, a memory of his sister's fire reflected in a stranger's eyes. Now reality was setting in. He had emptied his savings, jeopardized his ranch, and brought a complete stranger, an Apache woman, in a territory where such an act was tantamount to treason in the eyes of many, into his solitary life. He had no plan. He had only a raw, protective instinct that he didn't fully understand. What would he do when they reached his homestead? Offer her a horse and point her toward the mountains? The thought felt wrong, incomplete. He had intervened, and now he was responsible. For her part, Nizhoni remained a fortress of stoicism. She had been passed from one captor to another. This one was different, quieter, less overtly cruel than the others, but he was still a white man, an enemy by definition. His act at the auction could be a form of deception, a more patient way to break her spirit. She had seen kindness used as a weapon before, so she watched. She noted the way he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the land. She saw the weariness in the set of his shoulders, the profound sadness that seemed to permanently cloud his eyes when he thought no one was looking. He was a puzzle, and her survival depended on solving it. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. Silas led them off the main trail, into a shallow canyon carved by a small seasonal creek. Cottonwood trees grew along its banks, their leaves whispering in the faint breeze, offering the first real shade they'd had all day. "We'll make camp here," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken since leaving town. He dismounted and began unloading the mule, his movements methodical. He did not look at her, giving her space. Nizhoni slid from Daisy's back, her legs stiff. She moved to the creek's edge, her thirst a burning need. The water was cool and clear, a blessed relief. She knelt on the smooth, moss-covered stones, cupping the water in her hands and drinking deeply. Silas built a small, smokeless fire, the kind a scout would build to avoid detection. He made coffee and fried strips of bacon in a small pan. When it was cooked, he divided the meager meal onto 2 tin plates. He walked over to where she sat by the water's edge and held one out to her. She stared at the plate, then up at him. Her eyes, shadowed by exhaustion, were still wary. He simply held it there, patient, until she finally took it from his hand, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. It was the first physical contact between them, and it sent a strange jolt through the charged air. They ate in silence as twilight deepened the shadows in the canyon. The first stars began to prick the velvet darkness of the sky. The tension between them had eased slightly, replaced by a shared, bone-deep weariness. When they were finished, Nizhoni took her plate to the creek to rinse it. The rocks near the water were slick with algae. As she stood up, her worn moccasin slipped on a wet stone. She cried out, a short, sharp sound of surprise as she lost her balance, her arms flailing as she started to fall backward toward the rushing water. Silas moved without thinking. In 2 long strides he was there, his hand shooting out, closing around her forearm to steady her. His grip was firm, instinctual, meant only to prevent her fall. The rough fabric of her buckskin sleeve was torn near the cuff, and as he grabbed her, the material slid up her arm, exposing the pale skin of her inner wrist to the flickering firelight. And then he saw it. He froze. The air rushed from his lungs as if he'd been punched. The sound of the creek, the chirping of crickets, the entire world faded into a dull roar in his ears. Everything narrowed to the small, delicate mark on her skin. It was a tattoo, old and faded to a soft blue-gray, but the image was unmistakable. It was a hummingbird, its wings outstretched in flight rendered in a simple, stylized design. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a painful thud. His hand, still gripping her arm, began to tremble. It couldn't be. It was a ghost from another life, a secret symbol he thought had been buried and lost to the earth a decade ago. It was Ida's mark. He remembered the day she'd gotten it, a hot summer afternoon when she was barely 12. She had come running to him, her eyes shining with mischief and pride, holding out her wrist to show him the identical hummingbird. It was a blood pact, she'd whispered, a secret she shared with her best friend, a little Apache girl from a nearby band who had taught her the names of the stars. They were sisters of the heart, Ida had declared, and the hummingbird, the messenger, would forever bind their spirits no matter where they were. Silas had never known the girl's name. A year later, the treaties were broken, the fighting began, and Ida was gone, lost in a raid while he was away on a scouting mission. The little Apache girl and her people had vanished, swallowed by the war. He slowly released Nizhoni's arm, his eyes locked on the mark. He looked up at her face, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a captive or a stranger, but as a living link to the part of his soul he thought was dead. Nizhoni had recoiled the moment he'd grabbed her, her body tensing for a blow, but seeing his face, she grew still. His expression was one of raw, absolute shock, his stormy eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a pain so profound it was breathtaking. His gaze was fixed on her wrist, on the mark that had been a part of her for as long as she could remember. "The mark," Silas breathed, his voice a choked, broken whisper. "On your wrist. Where did you get that?" His vulnerability was a disarming weapon. It was not the voice of a captor, but of a man seeing a ghost. Her own defenses, so carefully constructed, began to crumble under the weight of his raw emotion. She looked down at the faded hummingbird, a symbol of a time before her world had been burned to ash. "It was a promise," she said softly, her voice husky, "from a lifetime ago." "A promise with who?" Silas pressed, taking a half-step closer, his entire being focused on her answer. She finally met his gaze, and for the first time, she let him see past the warrior's defiance to the woman within. "My friend," she said, the word tasting strange on her tongue after so many years. "A white girl. Her hair was the color of the sun in summer. Her name was Ida." Silas staggered back as if struck. The name, spoken aloud in this desolate canyon, shattered the last of his composure. A sound, half sob, half gasp, tore from his throat. He sank onto a nearby rock, burying his face in his hands. Nizhoni watched him, her heart beginning to pound with a dawning, impossible understanding. The man who had bought her at a slave auction, the quiet stranger who had shown her small kindnesses, was not a stranger at all. He was connected to the one pure, happy memory of her childhood, to the friend she had loved like a sister and mourned for a decade. The threads of their lives, torn apart by hatred and war, had just been woven back together in the most unlikely and astonishing way imaginable. The rest of the journey to Silas's ranch was transformed. The heavy, suspicious silence of the previous day had been replaced by something far more complex, a quiet space filled with the ghosts of a shared past. They rode side by side now, the pack mule trailing behind them both. Glances were exchanged, no longer guarded and assessing, but tentative and full of unspoken questions. The revelation by the creek had not erased the chasm between their two worlds, but it had built a fragile, astonishing bridge across it. For Silas, every time he looked at Nizhoni, he saw two people at once. The strong, resilient woman who had survived horrors he could only imagine, and the faint, shimmering outline of the little girl who had shared a secret with his sister. The weight of his guilt over Ida had not vanished, but for the first time in a decade it felt less like a stone and more like a memory he might one day be able to carry without being crushed by it. For Nizhoni, the man beside her was a paradox. He wore the face of her people's enemy, yet he carried the grief of her dearest childhood friend. He had bought her, yet he treated her with a deference that was utterly foreign. She remembered Ida speaking of her older brother, a quiet, serious boy who knew how to track animals and find the sweetest berries. It was like trying to reconcile a faded drawing from her memory with the living, breathing, and deeply wounded man beside her. They reached his valley, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows from the towering pines. The ranch was nestled in a small, protected meadow, a testament to one man's solitary labor. A sturdy log cabin stood at its heart, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A well-built corral housed two sturdy horses, and a modest barn stood against the tree line. The place was isolated, unvarnished, and possessed a quiet, rugged beauty. It was a haven, built by a man who wanted to keep the world at bay. As Silas dismounted, Nizhoni surveyed the homestead. She had expected a cage, but this felt like something else entirely. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary. "This is it," Silas said, his voice quiet. "This is my home." He gestured toward the cabin. "You are safe here. You are a guest." The word hung in the air between them. Guest. Not property, not captive. The distinction was everything. That evening they sat inside the small, clean cabin. A fire crackled in the hearth, chasing away the chill of the mountain night. The space was sparse and masculine. A simple cot, a sturdy table and two chairs, shelves holding a few books and neatly stacked supplies. After a simple meal of stew, Silas finally broke the silence that had settled between them. "Tell me about her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. as he stared into the flames. "After I left for the army." "Tell me about Ida." Nizhoni looked at his profile, the firelight catching the deep lines of sorrow on his face. She took a breath, reaching back across the years. "She was brave," Nizhoni began, her voice soft. "She never saw the differences between us. We showed each other our worlds. I taught her how to find the yarrow plant for healing and how to call the owls. She taught me words from your books and how to make a daisy chain. The hummingbird. It was her idea. She said it could fly backwards, that it could visit the past. She said it would keep our friendship safe, even if we were ever parted." Silas closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "I should have been there," he whispered, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. "The day the raiders came, I was on patrol miles away. By the time I got back, everything was smoke and ruin. They told me she was gone. I never forgave myself." Seeing his unshielded pain, Nizhoni felt an answering ache in her own heart. The grief that had been her solitary companion for so long now had an echo. "We all lost people in that fire," she said, her gaze becoming distant. "My husband, Victoria, he died 2 winters ago fighting men who wanted the land our people had always lived on. He was a great warrior, a kind man. He taught me how to be strong, how to survive when everything is taken from you." She spoke of her life, of the love she had shared with Victorio, of the slow, agonizing destruction of her community, and of her eventual capture. As she spoke, Silas listened, his full attention on her. He heard not just the story of a savage, as the men in town would call her, but the story of a woman who had loved, and lost, and endured. Their grief was different in its details, but identical in its depth. They were 2 survivors from opposite sides of a war, united by the ghosts they carried. In the days that followed, a new rhythm took shape. The fragile bridge of shared history became a foundation of trust. Silas showed her the ranch, explaining the endless cycle of chores that governed his life. He was surprised by how quickly she learned, and by her intuitive understanding of the animals. She moved with a quiet confidence, her presence softening the hard edges of his solitude. In turn, Nizhoni began to share her own knowledge. She showed him which roots were good for a cough and which leaves, when crushed, could soothe a burn. She pointed out the tracks of a mountain lion near the ridge, her senses far sharper than his had become in his years of isolation. She taught him the Apache names for the mountains that encircled the valley, making the landscape feel new to him, imbuing it with her history. He was no longer just the man who had bought her. He was Ida's brother. She was no longer a captive. She was the girl who had shared a secret with his sister. They were Silas and Nizhoni. Respect grew into something warmer, an unspoken affection that flickered in shared glances over the dinner table and lingered in the comfortable silences as they worked side by side. He found himself listening for the soft sound of her footsteps, found a smile touching his lips when he heard her speaking softly to the horses. He saw not just her strength, but the kindness in her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth. She, in turn, began to see past his grief to the decent, honorable man beneath. She saw the way he cared for his animals, the pride he took in his work, the deep well of loneliness in his eyes that was slowly receding. The attraction that sparked between them was quiet and tentative, like the first wildflowers of spring pushing through the frozen ground. It was a connection born not of passion, but of a profound and healing companionship. But while peace had settled in Silas's hidden valley, the ugliness of the world had not forgotten them. Back in Purgatory Gulch, Clarence's humiliation festered like a gangrenous wound. He had been outbid, made a fool of in front of the entire town, by a reclusive rancher. More than his pride, his greed was incensed. He had intended to sell the Apache woman to a wealthy client for a small fortune. Silas had cost him a significant profit, and Clarence was not a man who forgave a debt. He spent days nursing his fury in the grimiest saloon in town. His mind, slick and cunning as a snake, worked on a plan. He found a young, down-on-his-luck trapper who had once sought shelter with Silas during a blizzard. For the price of a bottle of whiskey and a handful of silver dollars, the trapper's loyalty was easily bought. He drew a crude map in the dirt on the saloon floor, marking the trail that led to Silas's isolated homestead. "He lives alone," the trapper slurred. "Got a good cabin, a couple of fine horses. No neighbors for 20 miles in any direction. No one would hear him scream." A predatory grin spread across Clarence's face. This was better than he had hoped. It wasn't just about getting the woman back anymore. It was about taking everything. He would reclaim his property, strip the ranch of anything valuable, and leave Silas in a shallow grave for the coyotes to find. He gathered a small crew of men, mercenaries and outlaws whose loyalty was only to coin. They were hard, brutal men, drawn to the promise of easy plunder. As they rode out of Purgatory Gulch under the cover of dusk, their saddlebags filled with whiskey and ammunition, a cold, malevolent purpose guided them north. They were a storm of greed and violence, gathering on the horizon, ready to descend upon the fragile sanctuary Silas and Nizhoni had just begun to build. The sun was a fiery smear on the western mountains, bleeding color into the evening sky. A fragile peace had settled over the valley, a peace Silas hadn't known in years. He was mending a harness on the porch of his cabin, the familiar scent of leather and oil in the air. Inside, he could hear Nizhoni humming softly, a low, melodic sound that had become the quiet heartbeat of his home. In just a short time, her presence had filled the empty spaces of his life, chasing the ghosts into the corners. The future, once a bleak and barren landscape, now held the tentative promise of a shared horizon. He looked up at the ridgeline, a habit ingrained from his scouting days, and that's when he saw it, a flicker of movement against the darkening pines. Not a deer or a coyote. It was the glint of setting sun on a rifle barrel. In an instant, the peaceful rancher was gone and the army scout took his place. "Nizhoni," he said, his voice low and urgent, not moving from his seat. "Get my rifle. Back of the cabin. Now." She appeared in the doorway, her song cut short. She didn't question him. She saw the coiled tension in his shoulders, the hard, lethal focus in his eyes. She disappeared back inside and returned a moment later, passing him the heavy Winchester rifle. Their hands brushed, and in that brief touch, a silent understanding passed between them. The world they had tried to escape had found them. "How many?" she whispered, her gaze scanning the trees. "I saw one," Silas replied, slowly rising to his feet. "But men like that don't travel alone." He chambered around, the metallic shink-clack unnaturally loud in the quiet evening. "It's Clarence." It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. The name settled between them, a foul poison. Nizhoni's face hardened, the soft lines of their shared peace replaced by the sharp angles of a survivor. She nodded once, then slipped back into the cabin, emerging a moment later with a long, wicked-looking skinning knife in her hand. Her eyes were dark pools of resolve. They had both fought for their lives before. Now they would fight for their home. The first shot came without warning, a deafening crack that splintered the porch railing inches from Silas's head. He threw himself to the side, rolling behind a stack of firewood, as another bullet tore through the air where he had been standing. "There are 5 of them," Nizhoni called from the window, "spreading out to surround us." Silas peered over the woodpile. He could see them now, dark shapes flitting between the trees, closing in. Greed and violence radiated from them like a foul heat. "They think we're farmers," Silas growled, a grim smile touching his lips. "They're in for a surprise." Clarence, emboldened, stepped out from behind a large pine. "Silas, you've got something that belongs to me. Send out the woman and we might just let you live." Silas answered with a shot. His bullet ripped through the bark of the tree next to Clarence's head, sending the man scrambling back into cover with a yelp of fear. The battle was joined. What Clarence and his hired guns had anticipated was a simple raid on a lone rancher. What they found was a coordinated 2-person army. Silas was a master of defensive positions. From the cover of the cabin, his rifle was a deadly instrument. He never wasted a shot, his movements calm and precise. Each crack of his Winchester was a punctuation mark in the unfolding chaos, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down, pinning them in place. But it was Nizhoni they never saw coming. While Silas laid down covering fire, she slipped out the back of the cabin like a ghost. She moved through the deepening twilight with a silence that was supernatural, her moccasined feet making no sound on the pine needles. She was a shadow, a part of the landscape they had foolishly invaded. One of the mercenaries, crouched behind the water trough, was lining up a shot at the cabin window. He never heard her approach. A hand clamped over his mouth from behind, and the cold steel of her knife slid across his throat. It was brutal, silent, and swift. She lowered his body to the ground without a sound and melted back into the shadows. Another attacker, trying to flank the barn, found his path blocked. A figure emerged from the darkness, and he raised his pistol, but he was too slow. Nizhoni moved like a striking snake. She used his momentum against him, a whirlwind of buckskin and fury, disarming him with a sharp blow to the wrist before the knife did its work. From the cabin, Silas watched in awe, He provided the thunder, she was the lightning. They were a perfect, deadly combination. He pinned down two men who were trying to advance, giving her the time and space she needed to move. He saw a flash of movement near the corral, and without hesitation fired, forcing a third man to dive for cover, right into the path where Nizhoni was waiting. Clarence, hiding behind a thicket of aspen trees, watched his men fall one by one, his arrogant confidence curdling into panicked fear. This wasn't going according to plan. The quiet rancher fought like a seasoned soldier, and the woman fought like a spirit of vengeance. He was out of his depth, facing a force he couldn't comprehend. Only one man was left besides Clarence. Desperate, the mercenary made a mad dash for the barn, hoping to set it ablaze and smoke them out. Silas saw him go, and his heart seized. The horses, Daisy, they were in there. He fired, but the man was fast, reaching the barn door. Before he could strike a match, the door creaked open. Nizhoni stood there, a silhouette against the darkness within. The man hesitated for a fatal second, confused. It was all the time she needed. She lunged forward, her knife flashing in the moonlight. He fell with a strangled cry. Silence descended upon the valley, thick and heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing and the chirping of crickets, indifferent to the human violence. Silas emerged from the cabin, rifle held ready, his eyes scanning the tree line. He and Nizhoni moved toward each other, meeting in the open space between the cabin and the barn. Their eyes met over the carnage, a silent acknowledgement of the terrible thing they had just done together to survive. "It's just him now," Silas said, his voice a low rasp. "Clarence, he is a coward," Nizhoni stated, her voice filled with contempt. "He will try to run." As if summoned by her words, a figure burst from the trees, scrambling not toward them, but toward the trail leading out of the valley. It was Clarence, his fine waistcoat torn, his face pale with terror. Silas raised his rifle. He had him dead to rights. His finger tightened on the trigger, but then he stopped. Killing him like this, shooting a man in the back as he fled, felt wrong. It was the kind of justice dispensed in Purgatory Gulch. Not here, not in their home. "No," Nizhoni said, placing a hand on the rifle barrel, gently pushing it down. "Not like that. His fate is not for us to decide." They watched as Clarence stumbled away into the darkness, a pathetic, broken man. He would face the justice of the wild, or the law, or perhaps another man with a grievance. His power was gone. He was nothing. In the profound quiet that followed, with the scent of gunpowder still sharp in the air, Silas and Nizhoni stood in the moonlight, surrounded by the wreckage of the attack. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving them shaky and raw. All the barriers, all the hesitations that had existed between them, were burned away in the fire of the battle. Silas turned to her, his stormy eyes filled with an emotion so powerful it left him breathless. He reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Nizhoni," he breathed, his voice cracking. "You." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. "We survived," she whispered. "Together." "It's more than that," he said, his voice thick with a decade of unspoken grief and a lifetime of newfound hope. "When I saw you on that platform, I saw my sister's strength, but tonight, I saw you. And I don't ever want to see a world without you in it. All the pain, all the loss, all the lonely years culminated in that single vulnerable confession." A tear slipped from Nizhoni's eye, a tear not of sorrow, but of release. "I thought my life was over when Victorio died," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought my heart was buried with him. But you found a part of me I thought was lost forever. You are Ida's brother, but you are also the man who showed me kindness when the world showed me only cruelty." He closed the small space between them, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you, Nizhoni, and I love you, Silas," she answered, the words as natural and true as the stars above them. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. It was a kiss of homecoming, a promise of a new beginning forged in the crucible of their shared pasts. It was the taste of solace, of safety, of a future he never thought he would have. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the moon climbed higher, washing the valley in silver. The bodies of their attackers were a grim reminder of the world's ugliness, but they were no longer a threat. They were just the last remnants of a past that no longer had power over them. Together, Silas and Nizhoni looked out at the valley, their valley. They had not just found love, They had rescued each other's souls and, in doing so, had finally, truly come home. True connection can bridge the deepest divides, and the bravest act is not to forget the past, but to find someone with whom you can build a new future, healing old wounds with shared strength and unexpected love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.